Okay. Hi, everybody. So let's begin. I want to welcome you all to the second of our Fall 2024 Scholars in the Square series. I'm very happy to see everyone here in the room. It's a full house here, and hello to those of you who are joining us through Zoom and who are joining us in the future through YouTube. The format will be new to some of you, so just so you know, Paige is going to speak about her research for 20 minutes, and then there's going to be a 20-minute period in which she will be engaged in conversation with somebody who knows her research area and kind of core questions quite well. In this case, the interlocutor is Dr. Abigail Eisenberg, who's a former fellow at the center, a good friend, and a professor in our political science department. After that, I'm going to chair a 20-minute kind of open conversation with people in the room and also on Zoom. And Rachel will let those of you on Zoom know how that happens. So our speaker today is Paige Thombs, a person who has been at the center for 8 years. That means she has kind of a record in how long she's been with us, and I'm so glad to have her. Paige is in the PhD program in the Faculty of Law here at UVic. Prior to entering the program, she worked in the advocacy sector for 15 years, doing a variety of things, fixing the world, and now she's here to answer big questions. Prior to that, she completed a BA in Religious Studies and English from the University of Waterloo, and an MA in History here at UVic. In her MA project, she looked at the development over time of the Trinity Western University Covenant. I should actually say covenants, which had become such a topic of controversy when secular law schools and courts in Canada objected to the university's approach to sex outside of heterosexual marriage. In her doctoral dissertation work, she's exploring experiences of religious lawyers within the ostensibly secular legal system. Both her MA and PhD projects offer windows into some of the central questions animating discussions among scholars of law, society, and religion in Canada and abroad. In particular, she's curious about the struggle to make our society as richly inclusive and diverse as possible. So in that spirit, before I turn the podium over to Paige, I want to acknowledge and respect the Musqueam peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Osage peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. So please join me in welcoming our dear friend and colleague, Paige Thombs.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. So, two caveats before we start. I am a middle-aged woman, and so I burst into flames fairly often. So if I'm fanning myself, it's not a heart attack. I'm just having a hot flash. Although nothing stresses me out more than being told that I can only speak for 20 minutes. I would much rather do an hour-long talk than a 20-minute talk. So I'm going to really try to get through this because I've been warned by both Paul and Rachel that I will be yanked away or a door will open beneath me to cut me off at the 20-minute mark. So I want to talk about religious lawyering, as it's sometimes known in the literature here in Canada, and just some thank yous. So thank you, of course, as always, to the Centre. Thank you to my colleagues at the Centre, all of whom just make my days so much richer. And of course, to my wife, who's been on this grad school journey for a long time with endless patience. I promise I will earn a living one day. Oh, I shouldn't have said that. So how, what's interesting about this is that I am neither a lawyer nor religious. And so somehow I have ended up looking at religious lawyering. And so what I mean by this, so for the purposes of this study, I am defining religious lawyering as, so lawyers who are practicing within a kind of Canadian common law context, they self-identify as religious, and for whom there is some kind of connection between that religious identity and how they practice, how they teach, how they study, and sometimes even how they interpret the law. So when I start these interviews with people, I do take a little bit of time to problematize some of these terms. And so I will often tell interviewees that I'm going to use words like religion or faith, and those words are meant to be catch-alls, but as we know, they don't catch all. And so I do ask them if there's words that they would rather I use, like spiritual, for example, that I'm happy to do that. But for today's purposes, I'm just going to say religious lawyering. So just some logistics. So I've spent about 18 to 20 months or so doing interviews. I've interviewed 85 people, which sounds great. I sort of wish I capped it now at 40 now that I have to go through all of the data. But it still feels like a really small number, given that I'm looking at almost all of Canada. 85 feels like a very small representation, especially when I know that there are a lot of religious lawyers in Canada. So the Christian Legal Fellowship, for example, has 700 members. So I haven't come anywhere close to those kinds of numbers, but 85 feels like feels small in some ways. So I have interviewed across Canada, so every province and every territory, with the exclusion of Quebec, and I can talk about that later, why I made that decision if there's time. And it's been a really broad range of religious identities. So you can see here on the board. So I've had Jewish people, both secular Jews and Orthodox Jews. I've had Buddhists, both people who were raised Buddhists and converted to Buddhism, Sikhs, people that fall under sort of a pagan umbrella, Baha'i, Muslim, atheists. I had an atheist person that really wanted to speak to me. Unitarian Universalists. It wasn't Peter. There are others out there. Indigenous spiritualities, Christians, and Christians have included, because I don't want to exclude anybody, because Christian is a really broad term. So I've had Catholics, I've had mainstream Protestants, I've had Anglicans, Seventh-day Adventists, Mormons, Quakers, Coptic, Pentecostal, United Church of Canada, born-again Christians, Salvation Army, and people that just sort of generally identify as evangelical. So it's been quite broad, although surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, there's been a lot of commonalities through those interviews. So this is sort of the main question that I started with, just to really kind of what is religious identity, or what is religious lawyering rather, and what does that look like? So I started with this question of how does religion and religious identity shape the experiences, the values, practices of those who practice, teach, and study Canadian common law, and is this problematic? And the reason I asked the problematic piece is because when I tell people what I'm doing, so if I say religious lawyering, often people think that I'm talking about lawyers that are practicing Talmudic law or canonical law, for example. And when I say, no, I'm talking about lawyers that practice Canadian common law and have a religious identity, and that shapes their identity. Many people have responded with aghast and sometimes even disgust that somebody would allow their religious identity to influence their legal practice, right? So never the twain shall meet. There's lots of other things that can influence your legal practice, but not religion. And I got that pushback as well when I was doing my Trinity Western stuff, because I don't know if I would say I was fully on the side of Trinity Western, but it was very gray for me. And for many people out there, the issue was very black or white. They should have a law school, they shouldn't have a law school. So I'm sorry, that's really small. I wasn't expecting that to be that small. It's also too many words. So if anybody's trying to figure out how to do a PowerPoint, this is not a great example here. So I've had kind of 5 objectives. So the first one, again, is just identifying the kind of how and where and who. The second one is around legal ethics, and that's something that I'm going to kind of touch on tonight. So whether or not legal ethics really conflict in the way that people imagine it does, is there any complementary relationship between the two? Understanding how religious lawyers kind of view the role of religion within the legal practice and the impact that secularization has perhaps had on religious lawyering. And then I have kind of an intersectional lens on this. And so I'm trying to determine whether or not certain intersecting identities create kind of unique challenges or opportunities. And then from the perspective of my interviewees, what do they bring to the practice? Are there benefits to this? So I do not have time, sadly, to go through all of these. And so I want to kind of focus on the sort of how it influences and then the ethics piece. And then if I have time, I want to just touch briefly on the benefits that interviewees believe they bring to the practice. So how does religious identity shape legal practice? I think many of these are not super surprising. So it can be the hours that they keep. So a lot of lawyers that I spoke to, they don't work on Sundays, or they at least keep half a day on Sunday for worship. I've spoken to some Orthodox Jews that are very strict around keeping the Sabbath, no matter what kind of trial they might be in the middle of. They finish Friday evening at sundown, and they do not answer their phones or their emails until sundown Saturday evening. Did I say Friday evening the first time? Okay. Kinds of cases they will or they won't accept. The ways in which they interact with colleagues and clients. Many talk quite passionately about the ways that they interact with clients because of their religious identity. For me, I guess the most sort of interesting one was this kind of last one here, this sense of justice and mercy that many of my interviewees talked about. In fact, so many of them talked about it quite early on in this process that I actually started asking interviewees, how do you view justice and how does the court view justice and how are they similar or contradictory? And there was a lot of contradiction between how they view justice and how the courts view justice. So many of them said things like, justice in the courts is sort of due process. They, there's some kind of retribution. They perhaps go to jail, they pay a fine. There's a sense of kind of equality in how maybe one person is treated versus another. For them, justice was something more along the lines of kind of substantial equality. So the first one is sort of a formal equality where we kind of treat everybody the same, and they see equality in a very different way, more substantive, so that you make adjustments for people based on perhaps their life history, perhaps on poverty or class. There is compassion in there in a way that there isn't in the courts. So that I think was the piece that was most surprising. This idea of mercy, it feels very Christian to me, and certainly my Christian interlocutors talked about mercy more than others, but others talked about mercy perhaps using other words, right? They talked about forgiveness, they talked about kindness, they talked about empathy. And so that was something that felt quite unique to me in the ways in which people answer this. And again, across the board, regardless of age or religious identity. So ethics. So this is the piece that that I was expecting to be the most meaty in here. And I think it has been, but perhaps not for the ways in which I expected it to be. So somebody on my committee has said, this is going to be an ethics paper. This is what this is. This is solely an ethics paper. I don't think that's actually true, but it's not an insubstantial piece of this. So what I was expecting when I asked people, so the question I generally ask is, let's talk about legal ethics. And in what ways does what is written in the codes of conduct, for example, or what the profession expects of you, because they're not necessarily the same, and what does your faith or your religious identity expect from you? And do they complement? Do they conflict? And when they do conflict, how do you mitigate that? There were almost no conflicts. And so many lawyers said, there's really no conflict for me. And if there is, I find a way to kind of figure it out. There were two sort of sticky things that came up for people. So I spoke to a Muslim lawyer, a young woman, who said that she does not nod before a judge. That kind of making yourself nodding before somebody, making yourself subservient to someone is something that she reserves exclusively for her relationship with God, and she will not do it. So if she was told that she couldn't practice unless she did it, she would stop practicing. And so every time she goes to court, nobody has really made too much of a stink about it, but when every time she goes to court, the judge has to be told in advance, she's not going to do this. The pushback that she gets from people is that it doesn't mean anything. It's just symbolic. It doesn't mean anything. And what she says is, it doesn't mean anything to you. This kind of action or this bowing means nothing to you. It means something really substantial to me. And what it means to me is that I bow before God and nobody else. Some of the literature on religious lawyering, which has kind of been around now since the 80s, says that many religious people, when push comes to shove, they will choose their religious identity and their religious commitments before anything else. I mean, they're talking about a certain kind of devout religious person, but I have seen that in these conversations. So even when there hasn't been a conflict, I ask people, if there was a conflict that you could not resolve, what would you do? And many of them have said they will choose their religious commitments over their job commitments. So the second one was the Law Society of Ontario Statement of Principles. I don't know if anybody remember this happening. This was a few years ago now, 2019. So this happened shortly after the Trinity Western debacle. So the Law Society of Ontario wrote up a statement of principles that emphasized human rights stuff. And I'm sorry, I wrote a quote down, but my notes are a little bit hidden. So what they say is that the issue was forcing members to adopt to a written statement. So many people pushed back, a lot of people pushed back. They saw this as forced speech. The intention of the statement of principles was specific to each licensee and can include a commitment to equality, diversity, and inclusion, and a commitment to uphold existing obligations with respect to the rules of professional conduct, et cetera. It goes on. And so what a lot of lawyers said was, first of all, the Law Society is overstepping their boundaries. This is forced speech. They were going to force a signature on it, which feels pretty ironic given that one of the issues that the Law Society of Ontario had with the community covenant was this forced signature. And so they were then doing the exact same thing. But the pushback was so strong that the Law Society eventually dropped it. And so I did speak to some Christian, I would say conservative Christian lawyers that really pushed back because they felt like the language was vague enough that if they signed on to it, they were eventually going to be expected to do something that was in opposition to their religious morals. They were going to have to take on a case that they didn't agree with because it fell under the guise of human rights. So, excuse me. So the current literature on legal ethics is really interesting because what it says now, we're in this kind of third generation of legal ethics literature, is that what it says is that the written codes of conduct, so between the codes of conduct and what actually happens in a legal practice, has a lot of gaps. It is not going to guide you through the myriad of conflicts that you may have in a long practice, and that you have to develop your own moral compass. But what is an acceptable moral framework within the practice of law is questionable. So we can see in law schools now, there are courses on feminist legal theory, queer legal theory, critical race theory, and those things are great and they're finally there and they're important, but there is no sort of religious legal theory. Religious law courses tend to be constitutional law courses that talk about freedom of religion cases, but there is no course that says, okay, well, how do you view the law through a religious lens? It doesn't seem to be an acceptable moral framework for working within the context of the law. And many lawyers, and we can maybe talk about this, many said that there's way more complements than there are conflicts. So in the written stuff, there's virtually no conflicts, but even in the practice, their religiosity helps them to actually make good ethical decisions. That without that, they would be sort of unmoored. Oops. Okay, so, am I done to the screen now? Okay, so this is actually my last, I think this is my last slide, or maybe my second last one. So, what do religious lawyers bring to the profession? So they talked to me about diversity. So one of my first interviewees, young man in the second year of law school, talked about, so he was Muslim, and he talked about the importance of diversity. So a legal profession that is reflective of the broader Canadian society, but he also talked about a particular area of expertise. So he said, as a Muslim, soon to be lawyer, if somebody comes to him around financial stuff, around family law, and they want to design a will, for example, in a particular way that aligns with Muslim values, they don't have to explain it. They don't have to justify it. He can provide that service to them in a way that feels good and comfortable and understood. This last one, almost every person said fairness, goodness, kindness, mercy, really ethical. And when my first interviewee said that, I think in my head, I probably rolled my eyes. I think it was just in my head, but I'm not entirely sure. But I had this feeling of, because I also get caught up in sort of religion being, I'm not sure, I'm gonna actually not say that out loud. So when they first talked about fairness and goodness and kindness, I thought, well, you don't have to be religious to be fair and to be good and to be kind. But the more people talked about it and elaborated on it, I felt like there was something there, that they had this thing bigger than them, that they have this relationship that holds them to be accountable in a way that perhaps a lawyer who doesn't have their own moral framework. And again, they could have said, well, I'm a feminist and that really holds me to a higher standard. But we weren't talking about that. We were talking about religion. And so this idea of being held to a higher standard that does not allow them to do something that doesn't include fairness, that doesn't embody kindness or goodness, or a really strong sense of ethics, is what a religious lawyer brings to the table. And I was actually pretty convinced of that by the end. So I think I'm going to leave it there. So, okay. It's the shortest I have ever spoken.
Yeah,
in that combination.
Well, thanks. So now we have an opportunity for you and Abigail to chat, and I'm just here to, I don't know, pour water or host lightly.
I could use a
host lightly.
Yeah.
Host lightly.
Well, for two of you, I don't need to host much. So
Well,
go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and it's just a pleasure, Paige, to be speaking to you about this project. I think it's great. I think it's fascinating. You've done some really very interesting work, and I mean, I have many questions. So, but let me start with where you left off, which is the idea of justice and mercy, and people from a religious place feeling that they are being held to a higher standard, which is probably a really good way of putting it. So I have, as someone who studies identity politics, I have significant skepticism about that. And that's because when we get into, in my research, when you see people getting into contexts where they're talking in a self-conscious way about their identity, they immediately start exaggerating their distinctiveness.
Sure.
And so what do you have any, like, what do you think of that? Do you have any evidence that this is not what's going on? Because it strikes me that, from a secular perspective, I have a sense there's of goodness and kindness, and I feel that if my job takes me away from being decent to students by doing things, I don't like it. And that's from a purely secular. So what's going on, do you think? Do you think there's an exaggerated sense, or why were you convinced by them?
Well, that's a good question, and I think we're out of time. So, the profession of law is adversarial, right? That's the language that you hear in law school, right? The zealous advocate, it's adversarial in nature. And so I think there is an expectation that lawyers aren't nice or kind, and that you're going to do whatever your client wants you to do in order to win a case. And some lawyers do that. They see that as their job. Whether or not they're exaggerating, I don't know. I mean, the way that I initially situated that question was, what benefits do religious lawyers bring to the practice? And David Seljak, who's on my committee, said, you can't really phrase it that way because you don't know, right? You're not going to have any measuring stick. You're not going to go out for 5 years into the field and determine that. This is from their perspective. And just the fact that almost all of them said it, regardless of age, regardless of religious identity or when they were called to the bar, that there is something there, even if they are delusional or even if they are exaggerating, they seem to believe it.
So just on that, because I just want to clarify. So I think they think that. I think that it's true that they have a sense of justice and mercy. The exaggeration comes, I think, from, if I would just hypothesize, that they believe that people who aren't religious don't have that.
Yeah, and I sometimes, depending on how the interview would go, I would push back a little bit, right? I would say, you don't need to have a religious identity to be good, be fair. And most of them would say, no, of course not. I don't have the monopoly on this. But I'm being held to this higher standard that I don't feel I can compromise, that I don't feel that there's any wiggle room for me, that if a client wants me to come in and do ABC, even though it might be legal and many lawyers would do it, I just can't, because it is going to disrupt that relationship that I have with God. So there is something there. Whether it's exaggerated or not, I felt like there was sincerity in it.
Okay. Well, I have another kind of, I have two other questions, but one is just, so the examples you gave here were really interesting examples about the formal aspects, symbolic aspects of being a lawyer that people with religious beliefs had objection to. So the nodding, I would have objections to bowing, like I would have a religious objection to it in the same way.
You personally?
Yeah, absolutely. I just find that not, like, I was raised not to do that to anybody except for in a religious context, to God. But I'm just wondering, since we have some parts of your research, maybe it was in the very small print there in that one slide, it was about the possibility that there would be cases that people wouldn't want to take, that there would be arguments that they would not want to make, that would be in their clients' interests. And I take it that you didn't really find that in your interviews, at least. But I'm wondering, I want to go there. Like, I want sort of like, what does that look like? Cases they wouldn't take.
Yeah, no, some of them did say, many of them have sort of mitigated this by choosing an area of law where there's probably not going to be an ethical conflict, right? A lot of them said criminal law, I can't do it. Although some also chose criminal law because they felt like it reflected the journey of Christ, for example, to serve the downtrodden, the guilty, the whatever. But criminal law often was the thing that people would cite as something that they wouldn't do. For some people, it was certain things within family law. Nobody said anything too inflammatory, like, I'm not going to take on a gay client. They steered clear of that, whether that might be the case or not. They didn't say it. But it was things like, I have no interest in helping a big corporation make a lot of money. I won't touch that. I have also things around alcohol came up a lot, not necessarily in terms of the kinds of cases, but the kind of work or the kind of firm that they would work at, because alcohol is still quite prevalent, I think, in the legal profession. So they sort of avoid that kind of thing, which makes the practice awkward sometimes, especially with law students. Yeah, so I would say family law and criminal law were the things that came up.
Family law and criminal law were
areas that they didn't want to touch, or there were things within criminal law or family law that they wouldn't do.
So I'm curious just to explore that, like what you think of. So I always viewed the legal profession, and also, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an expert in law. Just people at home. I'm not an expert in law, but I mean, I certainly thought of becoming a lawyer before I went to graduate school. And one of the things that would always come up is, would you defend some, heinous crime? And I always thought, well, I'm working for the state in a sense. If I was like, I'm partly working to figure out the nature of the law. And so I take it what you found, and maybe this is just a naive conception of law, is that people just don't have, they can work with respect to their preferences. They can lawyer with respect to, so my assessment of, like, someone might say, look, that's not what we allow the police to do. Why would we allow lawyers to do that?
To say, I don't want to take on that client.
Yeah, I don't want to take on that kind of case. I mean, especially people who are public defenders, who are being paid by taxpayers. I mean, not that I think that, but why should that be accommodated? Do you think there's a problem?
Well, public defenders, I think, will take on anything, right? I think when you become a public defender, you know that whatever sort of thrown in your lap. I will say lawyers in Canada do not have to take on cases. So it's different than the UK, where they have like a cab and rank file. So when a client comes to you, you have to take it. In Canada, you can turn down a case. And the code of conduct, both here in BC and in the Federation of Law Societies of Canada, which is the sort of umbrella for all the law societies, it does say that you have an obligation to avoid a conflict of interest. And so one could argue that that's a conflict of interest for me. And there is some stuff that says, if you are disgusted by your client and you cannot provide them a defense, you shouldn't take them on. Not only you don't have to, but you shouldn't.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting. So the form.
I will say though, I have more empathy, I guess, for criminal lawyers than I would have at one time, because I also feel like, how do you represent Paul Bernardo? Like, how do you do that? I couldn't do it. It wouldn't be for me. But everybody needs a defense. And if you were charged with a crime, you're going to be really glad that the lawyer's there, regardless of what you've done. I mean, it's a large degree of disgust in a crime like that, but people do it and they believe in the job that they're doing.
It's interesting because it just gives you a sense of the law profession as allowing a kind of a luxury and discretion that doctors aren't allowed, and that police aren't allowed. So it's kind of, am I wrong about that?
Well, doctors cherry pick, I mean, doctors have gotten in trouble for that, but so MAID has come up quite a bit in these conversations, and not necessarily because lawyers are really dealing with MAID, right? It's more the legislature that's or the lawmakers, but it's come up in that many lawyers feel like doctors have been given more freedom to choose with their conscience than lawyers have. So some provinces have said doctors do not have to prescribe the pill, refer for abortion, refer for MAID if it is in opposition to their ethics. The law doesn't say that clearly.
That's interesting. Do I have time for
Yep.
a question?
Yeah, definitely.
So I have a more theory, just I think this is such an interesting, and I bet you everybody has questions in this area. So I'm gonna skedaddle to a different area,
Okay.
which is just an area of my own personal, not personal, scholarly interest.
Mm.
So, and that's the difference between identity and religious identity and religious commitment.
Mm.
So on the one hand, I can see that there's all sorts of stuff in the legal profession and in the content of cases that would go against people's religious beliefs and commitments. But I wonder if having a religious identity is different in the sense that I can have a religious identity, but I'm also, I mean, maybe this is just a real Jewish perspective, but I'm really secular. So I can have a religious identity, but I don't apply my religious beliefs or commitment. So the difference I see, and I don't know if you agree with this, is that I would think everybody here has maybe an aspect, a religion, let's count secularism as a religious identity. I know that's very controversial, but let's just do that. And atheism as a religious identity. And we can't help in some sense, but apply the values of our identity to how we interpret the law, how we interpret situations. But we can help applying our beliefs and commitments to that. And we're actually in the immanent frame, the secular frame in which we live, we're expected to do that. So do you think that that's wrong in the end, that that's not the way to go, that distinction doesn't work?
The distinction between kind of religious beliefs and practices and religious identity?
Yeah.
Yeah. I would say, so maybe what I'll say is the way that I recruited the wording, I was going to get people that their religious identity shapes their legal practice. This wasn't a thing that went out to say any religious, lawyer, law student, law professor that has an identity, that's a religious identity, I want to speak to you. It was, has a religious identity, self-identified, and that identity in some ways, both big and small, influence how you approach the law. So those were the people that came to me. I am certain that there are lots more that keep it separate. And I actually did have a couple of interviewees that said, I really keep them separate. So they ended up being a very different kind of interview, but I think they wanted to be heard to say, yep, I have these beliefs and these practices and they're very important to me, but I don't feel like it's my place to have, frankly, I don't actually think you can take that hat off. I think that it's influencing their legal practice, whether they're aware of it or not. And that came out in a lot of the interviews where they initially said, I'm not sure that there's an influence. And then 10 minutes later, they're like, oh, yeah, actually this and this and this and this, because they never get asked and they never have an opportunity to talk about it. But I think the nature of my recruitment letter just meant that I had a certain kind of lawyer that was coming to me.
Oh, I see.
But you're asking more the normative question about, are you going to try to land in your dissertation on a kind of a sense that this is a better or worse approach?
Yeah, that's a good question. People keep asking me sort of what my core sort of argument is, and it keeps changing. It's not an opinion piece, right? So I don't want to say it's either right or wrong. What I want to say is it's present, and I think we need to be perhaps more accepting of that, and that it's not as problematic as many people seem to think it is. So if you look at, I try every September to look at the curriculum of law schools across Canada, and I already said this, right? So you will get those kind of third year outsider law courses, they call them, that is on sort of ethics, that's on critical race theory, that's what it means to be queer and be a lawyer, or often there's a course that encapsulates all these other identities. So they are considered appropriate moral frameworks through which to practice the law, which is very different than even 10 years ago, where you're sort of this neutral arbiter, and that there shouldn't be any crossover between morality and law, which I also think is nonsense, because historically the law we know comes from a sort of biblical or Christian or Jewish sense of ethics, and that seems to be forgotten. And so really what I want to argue is here's what it is and here's what it looks like, and it's not as problematic as we imagine it to be.
Interesting.
Can I come back to that first question, which was quite good, and let me just kind of
They were
come
all
back to
good.
it. Yeah, they're all good. That was especially.
Fantastic.
That was especially. And it's kind of a nerdy. I often ask the nerdy methodological question that kind of opens us up to the next section of this hour. And the question is more. It's around performance of identity. So I think you mentioned just a couple minutes ago that for some of these people, this is the first time they've ever had a chance to talk about this, right? Yeah. So that creates then a particular kind of theatrical interaction between you and that person, where you're asking questions that they've never, as it were, performed that answer.
Yeah, never.
And then I wonder, to come back to Abigail's question about identity, if that then forces them to concretize, kind of, it sort of incentivizes kind of a concreteness about what it means to be a Sikh or a Jewish or a Christian lawyer that might, in their actual, as it were, live legal practice, not show up. It might not be as crisp. In other words, if you did follow them for 5 years, which of course one couldn't do, you might sort of not notice them being all that different from a so-called secular atheist lawyer. But forced into a conversation with you, they have to start saying, yeah, I do that because I'm Jewish. A Jewish lawyer wouldn't do such and such. But 3 days before, they might not have done that, except that you put them into a context. It's not a criticism of the project, it's just a question about the way in which the scholars' questions kind of begin to incentivize an identity.
I will say that I asked very little question in this. So I ask, no, it's true, actually. It's really true. I tell them at the beginning, I don't want this to feel like an interview. I want it to feel conversational in nature. I will ask a couple of questions to sort of get the ball rolling. And I might ask questions based on something they've said, but for the most part, I really let them talk. And so I let their story unfold as they see fit. Sometimes they need a little bit of massaging because they haven't thought about this. I don't give the questions in advance. Partially because I want them to be thinking about it in the moment, and because the questions may not pertain to a particular individual. But when I let their stories unfold, I do think that there's some sincerity there. It doesn't feel entirely performative. Maybe I'll sort of highlight a couple of groups. So law students have been particularly interesting for me. There is really a sense that if they talk about their religious identity, and they also will tell me, they also give me some kind of indication of how religious they are, how devout they are, how often they go to mosque, for example. I have had some secular Jews that I've spoken to. I spoke to a Sikh man who doesn't follow most of the tenets of Sikhism, and so that was a really interesting conversation for him. There's sort of a cultural connection that influences. I don't think you can actually separate those two, but for him, there's sort of a cultural connection to Sikhism, and it influences how he practices. But for law students, and this didn't matter if they were at Vic or if they were at Osgood or if they were at Dalhousie or any of the different schools that were represented, they all talked about really needing to keep their religious identity hidden because there is a fear that they will destroy their career before it even begins. Now, whether that's real or not, or whether they're basing that on maybe something briefly that a professor said, they all had stories of, I tried to talk to my professor about what I'm believing and I was really dismissed. Or students will say oh, those people at Trinity or religious people or whatever, they are getting enough that it makes them wary about talking openly about it.
Perfect.
And then the other one that maybe, I wish I knew who was on Zoom because I don't want to offend anybody. But Christian lawyers were really, particularly conservative Christian lawyers, were interesting to speak to because they are feeling a shift in power in a way that other lawyers aren't feeling. So when I talked about secularization, or I asked questions around secularization, a lot of lawyers didn't really have anything to say, but particularly young people, right, where they haven't even really thought about this. They've grown up in a kind of secular Canada. And some maybe Muslim lawyers that have been around for a while, they see secularization as it's perhaps opened up the field to some more diversity. But for Christian lawyers, they are really feeling the pinch, which is really directly related to a loss of power.
Really perfect. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Now we have about 15 or so minutes to kind of open the conversation. We're going to privilege people who aren't going to be at the center tomorrow for the normal Friday tease out. So
I won't be there tomorrow.
You won't?
Yeah, I will be.
Because then we'll just talk about you.
Oh,
you don't want that. Is there anybody online? Great. Anybody in the room who's not going to be there tomorrow who would like to ask their question today? Because otherwise we're going to go to Debiani and you may regret it. Catherine.
Sorry, I can't come tomorrow. I was struck by the fact that you were talking at the individual level, given your interviews. That makes perfect sense. And then at a very general level. But most of these religions have a legal arm. And they work on these issues and they know what their public stance is going to be. And it would seem that you need to have that part of this conversation. How much, to what degree your individual spokesperson is reflecting their institution's perspective or think they should be contributing to it, and that it is a mediation to the larger secular state.
So what, can I ask you, what is your actual question? Sorry, I just want to make sure, sorry, that sounded cheekier than it was meant to, but I want to make sure that I actually address what you're asking.
Well, now let's see if I can get my actual question. This is a challenge. So I simply wonder to what degree your interviewees saw their denominations, legal positions, and structures as part of their legal identity or their buffer zone to a more general secular state identity.
Yeah, I think it really varied. I think there was, I think when I was speaking again to conservative Christians, there was much more commonality between those people. Like they were giving me a very kind of conservative Christian church answer, right? It was very reflective of what their kind of religious legal system might say. And also I think for some older people, it sounded like it was theology was coming directly from whatever they grew up with. For younger people, I didn't feel like they were being just automatically reflecting perhaps what Sikhism has told me. They're all living their religions in various ways, particularly the younger people.
Before we go to Debiani, can I just repose Catherine's question? Some of the traditions you're talking about have their own capital L legal subsystems, so the Lutherans and Anglicans have policy but not law. They don't have courts, but halakha, Sharia, Beit Din, these are legal orders and legal regimes. So that's different than the Lutherans, or Unitarians. So are people who
they would also talk about kind of natural law, right? Well, sort of law of God, not necessarily the law of the Lutherans, but they would talk about kind of natural law. It was interesting because the idea, so Talmudic law came up. I had 2 interviews with Orthodox Jewish lawyers, and Talmudic law certainly came up. And Sharia law came up once, maybe twice. they weren't really talking about their formal legal systems, even though they exist, right? And so we would talk a little bit about legal pluralism and this recognition that there's more than one legal system that people abide by, right? And most religious people are abiding by Canadian law. They're not intentionally breaking the law, but they're also living under this other law, whether it's something as formal as Sharia law, or it's just what they consider to be the sort of law of God. And lots of Christians talked about it in that way, more sort of natural law.
First of all,
Oh,
wonderful
Jenny.
presentation. No, I'm not going to ask that.
I really tried to convince Devyani to tell me what her questions were in advance, but I made some notes specifically so I could answer them.
So you used a really interesting word, religious morality. And you said morality is informed not just by, it could be solely by religion, or it could be other characteristics like their commitment or lack of it, or extent of it is debatable to outsider forces like feminist legal theory, CRT, queer legal theory, whatever. So, and by lawyers, I mean law professors, law students, practicing lawyers. So what happens when their morality conflicts with the law's morality? Because laws also have morality, or morality of outsider forces, or majoritarian morality, or justice. Any examples? Other questions I'll ask tomorrow.
Yeah, so I'll talk about kind of intersectionality for a minute, because I didn't get a chance to talk about this. We do talk about that. I mean, almost always the questions that I have in front of me, I never have to ask because they start answering them before I ever get a chance. And so the intersectional piece, interestingly, when I do ask, if I have to ask, it hasn't yielded as much information as I thought, but some interviewees talked about, their sense of morality coming from lots of places, right? Their religion first and foremost, but also their gender, or the fact that they've got children, or that they're a person of color, or that they have a disability, they're neurodiverse, or they're queer. And so there were lots of other things that were intersecting with this religious identity that was shaping their legal practice. In terms of what happens if there's a conflict between their own moral code, I'm never crazy about words like morality, but I'll use it here. So if I hear you correctly, you're sort of asking, like, what if there's a conflict between their own personal moral code and then the morality of law? Well, like I said, for the most part, there hasn't been a conflict, but when there has been, they side with their faith, I'll use that word, over their profession. So you and I talked recently about the Waring case. I don't know if anybody's familiar with this. So it's going to go to the Supreme Court of Canada, and I might do a coffee talk on this actually. So there's a young Sikh lawyer, I guess. So he's finished law school, he's articled, he's written the bar exam. He now has to become a member of the Law Society of Alberta, and that requires that he pledges allegiance, and he has refused. And the Law Society of Alberta will not allow him to become a member. And so
allegiance to what, or to whom?
To the state.
Oh.
Yeah, to the state. So I don't think it's to the Law Society itself. Well, it's the province, so I think it would be to Alberta. Right. So as a previous government employee, we also have to sign kind of allegiance of whatever government is in charge in the moment. And, you do it because it doesn't mean that much. But for him, again, it's like the nodding. He will not do it. And so it's gone to court and he lost. What the court of Alberta said is it's just symbolic. But symbolic of what, right? So symbolic of what? It's symbolic of something that you're saying, like, I'm subservient to the state. He has refused. So in that case, in that conflict, and again, other religious lawyers like Schaefer and Baba have said that many religious lawyers, they say most, I don't know if it's most, they're talking about a very particular kind of religious lawyer, but many will choose their religious identity over their professional identity. And so for Waring, if he loses at the Supreme Court, he's not going to be able to be a lawyer, at least not in Alberta. And if it becomes law of the land, then other provinces may do the same thing.
So Rachel has an online question.
From Lauren Strumos, who said that she thinks it's actually a pledge of allegiance to the monarch for that situation, but
Not sure.
who knows?
that it
I mean, this
is.
stops, the Mohawk won't pledge allegiance.
Yeah.
I mean, that there's a to the state,
Yeah.
and so this stops Mohawk from being lawyers as well.
But Lauren's question is wondering if any of your interviewees indicated whether they were all religious before they studied or practiced law, or if anyone started identifying as religious or converted after they began their studies or practice.
Yeah, great question, Lauren. Thank you. I asked them, so one of the sort of logistical questions I asked them at the beginning is, what is their religious identity and how has that shifted over time? And so many of them grew up in religious homes and they still identify as Sikh or Muslim, for example, but some converted. They were sort of loosely Anglican and converted to Buddhism, and after sort of law school, a couple people kind of grew up, sort of loosely Christian, and then were kind of born again, either in law school or after law school. And so those end up being slightly different interviews because they can't really talk about the law school experience as a religious person because that may have come later. But they haven't all been religious all their lives, but most of them have.
Okay.
Religious lawyers who presumably are very supportive of the freedom of religion. Do you find that there's any equivocation or reduction in their commitment to the freedom of conscience as a full charter right?
Yeah. So so sometimes freedom of conscience and assembly, it's been referred to as the kind of forgotten fundamental freedoms. So we do talk a lot about freedom of religion, but we don't talk as much about freedom of conscience. And that's a little bit about the Weirin case. They've made that about freedom of conscience because there is nothing necessarily in Sikhism that says you can't nod, but for him, it's about his own consciousness. And actually, I'm doing a talk next week on freedom of conscience around this topic. And a lot of them have said, like, this isn't, not a lot, but some have said the bigger question is freedom of assembly, freedom of conscience. So the two are kind of indivisible.
There's been a bit of an undercurrent through your talk, and thanks very much for sharing it all with us. We are talking about a settler colony, so I have to ask, how does proximity to whiteness maybe play into all of this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've had a lot of people of color, particularly younger law students, because law schools are becoming much more diverse. And I have had a handful of Indigenous people. When I ask about kind of intersectionality, and I give examples like, your racial identity, your sexual identity, whether you're a parent, the white people never talk about their race, right? I think they see themselves as the neutral, and they haven't had to think about it. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but a proximity to whiteness, I think, influences. I think lawyers that are people of color that have been around for a while are feeling it or experiencing it or have experienced it in a way different from younger law students today. So UVic Law, for example, the first year is the most diverse that it's ever been. And I think 50% now, I don't know.
Yeah, this time I think.
It's like, more than 50% are visible minorities. And so it's shifting. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Then potentially like the move to practice law, let's say among racialized people, wouldn't necessarily be in service of becoming white within the colony.
I don't think so anymore. Well, I think if you asked law schools, they would say definitely not. We're undoing that. We're dismantling that, decolonizing that. If you asked lawyers of color that are living in smaller provinces or smaller towns. They may say the same thing if they work for a big firm. Sorry, they may say something different if they're working at a big firm. They may also say something.
Thank you.
So unfortunately, we're out of time, but please join me in thanking Paige. That was great. Conversation. Now, just a quick note. Next week, something special is happening. I mean, something special is always happening. When you two are in the room, something special is always happening. But next week, something extra special is happening. One of my dear friends and a really brilliant colleague and a friend of Abigail's as well is coming to town to give the kind of kickoff lecture for a 3-day workshop we're hosting, Rachel and I, on, it's called We Should Know Better. And it's on scholar practitioners, like Western trained, mostly white scholar practitioners who take up kind of Asian religious practices and how they kind of make sense of that. And Margarera from Barcelona is coming to give that opening talk. It's going to be next door, yeah, in a room like this, but a little bigger so we can fit a few more people in. Please, if you're interested, please still sign up. It's going to have a similar structure to this, except her talk will be a little bit longer by itself. And I guess that's all I have to say right now. Anyway, thanks very much. See y'all.
Thank you.